Hi, this is Amy. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, can someone say something one more time? Just trying to test my audio. Hi, this is Amy.
Hey, Amy.
Okay.
How are you?
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Good. Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, can someone say something one more time? Just trying to test my audio. Hi, this is Amy.
Hey, Amy.
Okay.
How are you?
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Good. Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, can someone say something one more time? Just trying to test my. Okay. Colin should be joining. Hi, Colin.
Hi, everybody.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I actually had some people write in questions. So
great. Sounds good. Why don't we start there?
Yeah, so the first question, sorry, for everyone tuning in, my name is Amy Wan. I'm chair of the EOS Alliance Dispute Resolution and Arbitration Working Group. This is our second community call with Colin Boole. Colin, just to refresh people's memories, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. My name's Colin. I was director of online dispute resolution at eBay and PayPal for 8 years, and then spun out a company called Modria, which was the largest online dispute resolution service provider in the world. We got acquired last year by a big public company called Tyler Technologies. But my whole career has been in online dispute resolution. I've written a couple books and a bunch of journal articles about it, and I participated in the UNCITRAL process all the way through. So I know a lot about ODR.
Awesome. Okay, so the questions that people wrote in today are a bit more nuanced, a bit more complicated.
Sure. Hit me. I like hard
all
questions.
Right. Okay. So the first question is, can dispute resolution on EOS exist without block producers being involved whatsoever? So I think this question is specifically on the enforcement side. Once you have a resolution,
Sure.
Can we have automatic enforcement as opposed to manual enforcement?
Yeah. So, I mean, you and I need to answer this question together. My sense of the way things are architected, the best way to do that is escrow. And essentially, if you code escrow right, then you have absolute enforcement power. Because in essence, you put a clause into the contract that says, if a dispute arises and both sides disagree about what the appropriate outcome is, there's a kind of a third-party escrow agent that has a vote. And whatever that escrow agent decides is obviously going to side with one or the other party, and then they can essentially determine the appropriate outcome. So, escrow provides you 100% enforcement. And, that's the way a lot of payment disputes are handled in Asia. In the US, a lot of people aren't willing to use escrow. They use credit models. There's other ways to enforce as well, but there are ways to code it in such a way that enforcement is absolute, even if the parties don't necessarily agree with the outcome determined. So, Amy,
Cool.
what do you think about that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I actually think people are working on technical solutions that automate enforcement. I've been hearing stuff about pseudo. I don't know what the status of that is, but from what I heard, presumably pseudo is supposed to allow for automated enforcement. But that's what I've heard. I'm not sure about the status of that. I'm not the expert on pseudo.
Well, I do think enforcement is the number one determinant of ODR success. People don't want a decision saying they're entitled to a refund. They want the refund. So we have to code it in such a way that enforcement is absolute, 100%.
I agree.
And if you look at the UDRP for domain name disputes under ICANN, they have total enforcement power because they can change the domain name database. So I think we need to architect this system in a similar way, where when you go through an ODR process, the outcome is 100% enforceable.
And the other thing I'll just add is that when it comes to block producers, I don't think the job that they signed up for is sitting there and enforcing, resolutions to disputes all day long, because today it might be 300, but tomorrow it's going to be thousands or tens of thousands, right? And so I do think enforcement does need to be automated for block producers.
Yep.
By the way, just to quickly add, if any of the participants on this call also have questions, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue down this list I have here. So the second question is also more of a technical one. In terms of how fast blocks are produced on, in terms of how fast blocks are processed on EOS, how is dispute resolution possible without adding time delays? Would you apply dispute resolution on EOS specifically? How would you apply dispute resolution on EOS specifically, knowing the constraints of blockchain?
Okay, well, you need to help me with the constraints of blockchain. But I think one of the things that is very important is we need to figure out appropriate timelines for these cases. For instance, if someone reports a problem and we need to give the counterparty, the complainant reports the problem, the counterparty has a certain window within to respond. And if they don't respond within that window, we may close the case and then automatically in favor of the complainant. So we have to say, how many days do we want to give the respondent to respond to the complaint? And I think that that's an important question. I mean, obviously in the courts, you have, months sometimes to respond. But that's because you're dealing with face-to-face interactions and mail and blah, blah, blah. I think on eBay, we gave people usually like 5 days to respond. You can also make that 5 business days. You can also take into account holidays. There's other things that you can do. But right, we need to figure out what an appropriate response window is that maximizes A, timeliness to resolution, but B, fairness to the parties as well. You don't want people losing because the response window is too small and they just never saw it. So.
And I was actually just talking with someone the other day, so someone wants to know, Colin, how long do you think is appropriate as a response window?
Well, again, what's the average value of these disputes, I think, is an interesting question. I think the higher the value, I think it's appropriate to have a longer response window. At eBay, we found that people would rather lose their dispute quickly than win their dispute and have it take a long period of time. And a long period of time on eBay was 12 days. If the resolution process took longer than 12 days, people were more frustrated than if they had just lost on day one. but that's because the average transaction value is about 75 bucks. So, we're not talking about $50,000. If the transaction value is higher, you want to give a slightly longer response window, I think. But we also want to get these cases wrapped up quickly. And, so I think it's very important that we focus on getting the parties to try and resolve it directly themselves first. And if we can't, then we go through an expedited kind of fact finding and then render a decision. I don't think that these disputes are going to be amenable to mediation, like a long, well, why don't you tell me what you think? And what do you think? These are transactional disputes, probably between strangers, people that don't have a very close relationship. There's a lot of data that's relevant. So we're going to want to bring all that data in on an automated basis. So when the complainant files the case, we pull in all the information that we can about the transaction so that they don't have to provide it. We just, we have it available. But if it does get to the point where a decision needs to be rendered, then the third party comes in, they ask a question or two, they render a decision. Hopefully they don't even need to ask a question because of all of the data that's been automatically pulled in. So we don't want to have a lot of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Presumably there's been some of that before they even started this formal process. So I don't know, to answer the question, I would say 7 days. But let's take a look at how many back and forths there are. We also are going to have, if we bring in a third party arbitrator, that arbitrator is going to have a response window too. So we need to think about how much time we give them. But I would love if we could deliver resolutions within 2 weeks. I think that's important for satisfaction and credibility of the system. Those are my initial thoughts. So Amy, what do you think?
Yeah, so when we were architecting Sagewise for Ethereum, the big difference between Ethereum and EOS is that EOS is built on the concept of time delays, whereas Ethereum is not. And so we ran into the same problem, and we actually architected time delays for the Ethereum blockchain so that when someone's, for example, entering into a smart contract, they can, when they're putting the SDK into their smart contract, they go and set up certain parameters when they're setting up that SDK. And that parameter can be, we want to delay, execution of the smart contract by 12 hours or 24 hours or 48 hours. And so, prior to things executing, when it's supposed to execute, actually, it would A, be delayed by a certain number of hours, but B, they would also receive some sort of notification so they can stop even writing to the blockchain before it executes, right? And if they receive a notification and like, oh no, this is not what's supposed to happen, they press the freeze button and it just doesn't execute, period. It just gives them the luxury of time to figure out whatever it is that needs to be fixed.
Sure.
The only thing is that the way we architected our system, you could set up your own time delays. On EOS, I think right now it's automatic time delays of 3 seconds, and I don't think 3 seconds is nearly long enough. But at least the way we architected things, again, you do want to look at transaction value, right? Like maybe if it's a small thing, you're going to set a time delay for 12 hours. Maybe if it's like a multi-million-dollar deal, you're going to have it for quite a little bit longer.
I will say one of the things that we wrestled with both at eBay and PayPal and at Modria is once you start to create kind of more complicated processes where the delay, for instance, is based on item value, sometimes people get confused because they'll have a dispute over $1,000 and the delay will be X. And then they'll have a dispute over $5,000 and the delay will be Y, and they don't really understand why the difference was. And they may presume that their first experience is a guide to their second experience. So there are values in providing human type clarity in these processes. You want to keep it simple, as simple as you can, that doesn't disadvantage other folks. I mean, the other thing that's going to be a challenge with EOS is you have transactions all over the world. So, it may be that, $50 is not much in the United States, but $50 is a huge amount in India. So, again, do you want to figure out sliding scales based on geographic regions and things like that? I mean, you can over-engineer it, but, so I think these are important design questions.
Fantastic, thanks. Okay, next question. UNCITRAL. So there's actually been a lot of talk around UNCITRAL over the past, couple weeks or two on the Telegram arbitration chat. Can you tell us, or can you actually explain to us, what does it mean to sign onto UNCITRAL? Like, how do you become a signatory versus how do you comply with UNCITRAL? And to the extent that the EOS arbitration system wants to comply with UNCITRAL, how do we go about doing that?
So unfortunately, you can comply with UNCITRAL in that the end of that process generated a document that sort of has best practices. But our objective was to create a soft law, essentially, that countries could adopt in their own, legislatures. And then slowly but surely, we would have countries around the world opting into the UNCITRAL structure. That was not actually where things ended up due to some political debates and disagreements between the United States and the EU. So what I would actually recommend is if you want to abide by a system, don't focus on the UNCITRAL design. Focus on this new ODR design that's coming out of APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic, cooperative alliance or whatever. It's a giant multinational organization that has most Asian countries, but it also has the United States or some Latin American countries that are members of it too. They're putting together an SMB arbitration ODR flow right now. And that to me seems like something that you will be able to opt into and leverage. Whether or not it's going to be appropriate for all these types of disputes, it will have international arbitration panelists who are available through it. And it seems like the timing might sync up well. Now, I don't mean to demean what the work we did at UNCITRAL. It was a lot of work that was put into coming up with essentially that structure. And we were very disappointed when it wasn't adopted formally because they couldn't get agreement amongst all the 60 participating member delegations on exactly what the rules should be. That also was focused on cross-border consumer disputes. So there was great reluctance to use arbitration, for instance, because a lot of countries are conflicted about the use of arbitration in consumer cases. In B2B cases, they're totally fine with use of arbitration. But, they wanted it to be all the way up through mediation where the buyer had to agree, and they never wanted to prevent a buyer from getting access to the courts. So, that's something that we need to think about too. Are we going to say, hey, if you have a dispute through EOS, this is the final redress. You are not allowed to, if you get an outcome from this process, is it appealable in your local court? And obviously in the United States, we have these pre-dispute binding arbitration agreements. That's going to be an important design decision because it also means that we can render good decisions that we think are fair. And a certain percentage of those people may say, okay, well, I disagree with it. I'm going to go file a lawsuit. And then we have to go through it again. So, I think the UNCITRAL design principles are a great yardstick for us to use to measure what we put together. But it's not like you can opt into UNCITRAL and then suddenly you're clicking into this global, system where other countries and other dispute resolution firms have also opted into UNCITRAL, and then it's all cooperative. Actually, one of the reasons why UNCITRAL failed was because the EU launched its own ODR regulation. And so all EU member states now opt in to this ODR scheme for consumer disputes. And the EU said, well, we don't want to participate in the UNCITRAL process because we want to design our own. And that's essentially what they've done. So you could take a look at the EU design and see whether or not you want to leverage that. But I'm not sure if you would. Actually, I don't think it's that great. I think we can come up with better stuff than what the EU is doing. But so does that provide additional clarity, Amy?
Yeah. So do you want to tell us actually, since we're on the topic, do you want to tell us a little bit about the APEC framework? How does someone go about opting in, and what are the differences in terms of arbitration, enforcement in the real world, things like that?
Well, some of that's still TBD. There's a meeting in Osaka on November 7th where they're going to refine this further. And then there's another meeting, I think, in Santiago next March to refine it further. And I can send over some of the discussions that people are having about how it's structured. But what they're doing essentially, it's intended for B2B disputes between small and medium-sized businesses that often can't afford redress in court. And again, it's focused on cross-border cases. So they're very transactional, which I think mirrors fairly well the EOS transaction types. Essentially, arbitration organizations are able to opt in, and there's going to be a central repository of cases so that people can report it to kind of the core network. And then those cases are going to be assigned on a round-robin basis to the various arbitration providers to eliminate the selection bias issue that they have in ICANN. I don't know if people are aware of that, but in ICANN, the complainant picks the dispute resolution service provider, which leads to a real selection bias issue because everybody picks WIPO because they're one of the approved providers and they decide for the complainant like 90% of the time. So the APEC design solves that issue by being a forced round robin so the complainant doesn't pick the service provider. It also enables multiple dispute resolution service providers to opt in, and then they can get cases as part of the queue once they get approved. So, I think it's well designed. I mean, they've asked a lot of the ODR experts for advice on how to put it together. So that's something that we could leverage. It's not apples to apples. I think I need to learn more about what kinds of disputes are likely in EOS. But, if the average dispute value is, say, more than $5,000, then I think the APEC design is great. If we're talking about dispute values more like along the PayPal lines where you've got $50 disputes and $100 disputes, I don't think the APEC design. It's going to be swatting a fly with a sledgehammer because the arbitrators are going to be deciding these cases. These are going to be really high-powered folks. And I don't think that they're going to be interested in, resolving $100 disputes. It's just not going to be worth their time.
I think that EOS is still trying to figure out what transaction sizes on EOS looks like. But
Sure.
If it is, the fly swatter type, what would you recommend then?
Well, I think then you need more of a customer service type model. Like I said, at eBay, we did 60 million disputes a year. 90% of those we could decide without touching the case, or they got an outcome without touching the case. 50% were decided amicably, but that meant we still had 10%, which was 6 million cases a year. And then you got to have people on headsets. In essence, their jobs to come in and handle these cases, decide them. You can further tune the software and automate more and more and more. I mean, there was one volume we had at eBay. It was more than 30 million cases a year, and it was entirely automated. And the book that I wrote, New Handshake, was a design for a 100% automated resolution process between consumers and merchants. So that could be a model, New Handshake, for EOS if we're getting into consumer transaction type issues. If it's higher dollar value, then I think it is worth it to have professional arbitrators looking at these cases, and that's more along the lines of the ICANN model. They have professional arbitrators around the world. The other thing that ICANN has done is they've chosen dispute resolution service providers from each region. And the benefit of that, and that the complainant can pick the provider, is if you have a dispute over a Chinese domain name, you can go to the Asian Domain Name Dispute Resolution Center, and you know that you're going to get a Chinese arbitrator. Whereas if you go to CPR or if you go to ADR.EU, you might not get someone who knows. And fluency is important in those disputes. I mean, some of the outcomes that have been rendered have been flawed because the arbitrators don't understand the language of the dispute. So they say that something is a trademark violation when in fact it's not. So, again, we just need to figure out where our sweet spot is. We could also have a hybrid. I mean, I'm sure EOS would love to be used for consumer transactions. So maybe below a certain threshold, it's more of the automated process, and above a certain threshold, you actually get arbitrators. So that's another possibility. But the APEC design is more B2B, it's higher dollar value. And I think that's also the ICANN design. But then the New Handshake design is more low value. You don't want to pay an arbitrator $500 to resolve a $50 case. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's what we got to figure out.
Fantastic. Josh, you have a question. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Colin, touching on automation, I'm curious what kind of backlog, or backlog's probably not the right word, but what kind of cases that have been resolved in the past did you need before you can start to automate large amounts of disputes? Because obviously if you have a a case file of 10 million cases, you can start to use that to say these need to be automated in this way. EOS obviously doesn't have that large a file yet.
Sure.
What do you think needs to be seen?
Well, it's all heading in the direction of machine learning. So the more cases you have, the better, because that's all about data. But the automation that we did at eBay and PayPal was all policy based. So it was humans writing those rules. And, we were looking at the case volumes that were coming in and saying, okay, cases that fit this profile. Like, again, not knowing the types of cases at EOS, I think is an interesting question. But, we had issues where someone would buy something and then they wouldn't get it. So we called that an item not received dispute. So then we would go to the seller and we would say, it's your obligation to prove that the buyer received this. So you have to have delivery confirmation. And if the value of the item is over $250, you have to give a signature confirmation. So that was our policy. We had a policy. We made that clear to all the merchants in advance. If you don't have this evidence, you're going to lose, right? So that's not machine learning. We wrote a software program that essentially said, okay, buyer, what kind of dispute do you have? Well, I have an item not received dispute. Okay. Do we have a tracking number? Do we have, some way that we can find out where the item is? No, we don't. Okay, seller, you have to give us delivery confirmation or signature confirmation, or you're going to lose this, and you have to do that within 5 days. So it's a very structured process that gives you closure in 100% of cases because the seller knows they have the evidentiary obligation. Now, another kind of dispute is where a buyer buys an item and they get it, but it's not what they thought it was going to be. So that's a little bit more complicated, right? Is it that the item was misrepresented? Is it that the buyer had unreasonable expectations? Is the way that the item is not acceptable to the buyer, is that fixable? Can there be a partial refund that would make the buyer satisfied? Or does the buyer want to return the item and get a full refund? Or does the seller want to provide a replacement item? So again, in these types of consumer cases, there are ways that we can create a taxonomy for the various dispute types. And the more cases we get, the more we can learn. But we're creating policies that provide clarity and outcome in 100% of cases. Now, if we get to the point where we have a machine learning algorithm that can look at tens of millions of cases and figure out, okay, with this information submitted, 98% sure the right decision is to give the money back to the buyer. That's great. We can get there eventually, but that's not what it's going to be out of the box. So hopefully question. Yeah,
no, I appreciate that very much. And did you guys, through automation, use a lot of A/B testing to see what people were more satisfied with?
Absolutely. We had so many cases. We had something between 12 and 16,000 cases a day. So we could change some text, we could change an option, and then we would evaluate how that changed the waterfall of outcomes. And we could also deliver different pages to different groups, and say, okay, we're going to A/B test the two flows. The great news about that was, we would make a change. We'd make an upstream change before a dispute ever arose, and we could see that it would drop our dispute rates. And that let us tune. When we launched the process, I think we had like a 70% automated resolution rate. And then by changing over time, that crept up to 80, and then it crept up to 90. So, you guys know, you can refine the algorithms once you get the data. But, it is all headed in the direction of machine learning, and especially at high volumes. Then we don't need human arbitrators. We can have machines decide the cases. And then, what we could do is we can have machines decide the cases, and we can give people an appeal. And that may go to a human. But if the machines are doing a good job, then it's only going to be, 2 to 5% of cases that ever get appealed. So then we're just dealing with a tiny subset of the overall case volume. So, again, hopefully we'll get to a situation where we got millions of cases, and then, we can learn from them. But in the early days, we can just set policies.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Kevin, you had a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask it?
He typed it in, right? So we could even see.
The question that I typed actually was specifically talking. I came in the meeting in the middle of your answer talking about the round robin setup, and a small question about that was does that assume if you have a round robin setup that post filing a dispute you would award the case to some DR provider? Does that assume that they're all operating under the same model or same RDR, or is that lever they can pull to have some kind of competitive advantage?
I think just like ICANN, it's very important that all the dispute resolution service providers have similar processes. They can have different software, they can have different customer support. Again, if you're automatically assigning people to dispute resolution providers, then there's not much of an opportunity for competition, because the parties say, oh, okay, you ended up with AAA, or you ended up with Sagewise, or you ended up with Fairclaim. So they may go, oh, okay, I don't like the fair claim process as much as I like AAA's process, but they can't do anything about it. I will say, again, if they're higher dollar value cases, there's a lot more flexibility in terms of figuring out who gets what case. It may be that, you could say, all right, these are your different providers. Which one do you want to use? Or we will assign you a neutral. And if you don't like this neutral, then you can say, I don't like this neutral, and then we'll assign you another one. It doesn't have to be just pure round robin, because then people kind of feel like they're in a machine and what they get. But as long as we're monitoring the various providers and ensuring they have high quality, the other thing is we can provide a technology interface. We write the code, and then the arbitrators have to use that software interface, which then reduces the difference. I mean, in ICANN, if I file with WIPO, I have a totally different experience than if I file with ADR.EU. It's just, completely different software platforms, completely different, but the rules are consistent because everybody's opted into the UDRP, but the user experience is radically different. And it may be that, we could use Sagewise, for instance, and all of the providers would be coming in through the same software platform. So then really the main thing you're focused on is the credibility and credentials of the neutral you're assigned. So we say, okay, based on the round robin, here's your neutral, here's their bio. If there's a reason why you think you have a conflict or you think they can't do a good job, click this button and we'll get you another neutral. And then it goes right back into the round robin and then they get another one. And maybe they have, I don't know, 1 or 2 strikes. We don't want them to just keep striking until they get somebody that they think is better. But there's a lot of creative ways we could do that. Again, it's more appropriate to do that in higher dollar value cases. For lower value cases, look, you're just going to get a neutral. They're going to decide it and we're going to move on.
That there are 2 things in there that you mentioned that really struck me, which was designing a basic software that must be used in some capacity, because otherwise, to be able to monitor and qualify someone based on their processes is difficult in a decentralized system. But making sure that the software as part of the system code must be used, it kind of removes that fear of centralization that you hear often about. But actually, my real question, I don't want to take up all your time. My actual question was I've tried to think a lot about how disputes would be resolved. Let's assume that we're talking about a large case that's $5,000, $10,000, and it involves property valued at above $10,000 that's on chain. So tokens that are on the EOS blockchain.
Sure.
Being able to resolve those disputes where identity is possibly not very strong, and also the award debtor is call them uncompliant or non-compliant with the order. I'm trying to figure out a way that a system could be set up where block producers or the ultimate authority on the network they're the ones that validating transactions, et cetera, that they do not have to enforce these things. So,
totally.
So trying to have it all be solved without ever getting to a block producer. And I was wondering if you had ever given that thought.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this was something that we wrestled with a lot in the eBay PayPal context, because eBay in the early days, before they owned PayPal, we had a big enforcement challenge because, a seller would owe money to a buyer and we couldn't make them pay. So what did we do? We created pain to incentivize them to do it. Like, we're going to suspend you from the marketplace. We're going to limit your account so you can only sell, $1,000 worth of goods at a time. Or, essentially you're using the stick to incentivize them to pay up. And then once they pay up, then you remove those limitations. That's not a very efficient way to do it. Once eBay bought PayPal and they essentially forced all the volume onto PayPal, well, obviously we controlled the wallet. So if a buyer filed a dispute and a seller disagreed, and we decided the buyer was entitled to a refund, we would just go into their PayPal wallet and take the money and then give it to the buyer, even when the seller wasn't very happy about that. Now, sometimes the seller had zero balance, so we would take them negative. And that meant that any money that they made on eBay, any incoming money, would go to pay us back for the debt that they went into. So, again, you guys aren't going to have control over these wallets for all of these participants in the same way that eBay had control over PayPal. When I talk about, the escrow model, that's kind of the way credit cards work, right? If you're going to get a merchant account, you have to pay a deposit. You have to put down, depending on how risky you are. If you're a small merchant, they'll make you pay a very high percentage of each payment to the merchant service provider. Plus, they're going to make you put down $2,000 in a deposit. So if you have a chargeback against you, they're going to take that money out of your deposit because the credit card networks are not willing to essentially front the money like we were doing at eBay, so as to reduce friction in the marketplace. So that's another possibility, like you have to have a deposit in order to participate in the process. Escrow, as I said, is another way to do it too, where the buyer pays the seller, but it doesn't clear to the seller's account. It actually goes into this hold state, this escrow state, and then the seller has to deliver service to the buyer. And then we ask the buyer, okay, are you satisfied? And if the buyer says, yeah, I'm satisfied, okay, then we release it out of the escrow state and then it hits the seller's account. If the buyer says, well, actually, no, I'm not satisfied, then we go to the seller and say, okay, look, seller, you got to make sure the buyer is satisfied because we're not going to release the funds until, they give us the thumbs up. And, the seller can do additional things to try and get the buyer's thumbs up. And if the buyer doesn't give the thumbs up, well, then we still have the money in the escrow state. So we can say, all right, you know what, we've determined that the seller did not deliver to the value to the buyer that the buyer was entitled to. So we can click a button and then release the funds from escrow back to the buyer. So, that's kind of another way. Again, it creates more friction in the marketplace, but it makes enforcement a lock because you always have the funds in question. The problem is if you clear payments direct from the buyer to the seller and say to the seller, okay, don't ship until you receive the funds. Well, once the seller walks away with that money, with those, EOS credits, you can't get them back. That's the Craigslist problem, right? If you're paying somebody in a parking lot for a laptop and you take it home and the thing bursts into flames, you can't reverse the funds. You don't know who they are. They've walked away. You can't click a button to pull it out of their wallet. So we need to make sure that there's a way that we can get the money back because that's the way that you incentivize good behavior. That's why Craigslist is such a swamp of fraud. And in the eBay early days, a lot of people, say, oh yeah, pay me through Western Union again, which is the same thing. If someone pays you through Western Union, you go into some gas station, they hit a button, they give you the money out of the cash register. It's not reversible. So we just need to design the transaction system in such a way that we have the ability to do the reversal if need be. And it's a question of, where do we put that friction in place?
There's a lot of, thank you very much for your answer. There are a lot of proposals circulating around the community that deal with deposits and just call it by a different word is a bond. So it would be, that'll be interesting. I look forward to exploring that stuff more. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, bonds are very common in the construction industry for a huge amount. You got to set the money down. The other thing, that's the way it works in the insurance industry too. You have to have enough money on hand to pay out all of your claims. So that just means you have this giant reserve of money that you have to have out there. And, you earn interest on it. It's your money, but you have to have that in place. And you can't write any more policies if you don't increase the size of that reserve. So, that's a way to provide surety in essence. And they sometimes call them surety bonds.
Great. So next question, and this question refers to the RDRs, the Rules of Dispute Resolution. I don't know if you've had a chance to review them. The question is, what are your thoughts on the RDRs? Do they need to be rewritten? If they do need to be rewritten, what would you change about them?
Yeah, I haven't reviewed them in that much detail. I could, take a run through it and sort of put some comments into the document, Amy. But if you could surface some of the areas of controversy, maybe we could address them one by one. But I don't know them well enough to give it my immediate reactions. I think you did send over the document, and I looked through it, and I thought it looked pretty good. just on first read, but I haven't done a detailed review.
Okay, that's fine. No worries. Standards for dispute resolution vendors. Do you have thoughts on those? What are some standards that the community should consider?
Yeah, so we've created an organization called ICODR, which is the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution. You can look it up at icodr.org. And this really is an effort to distill best practices in terms of standards and ethical principles. It's pretty generic because obviously we're talking about lots of kinds of dispute resolution, transactional dispute resolution, court-based ODR, really anything that anybody's doing, family. But if you look at those standards, I think that's a good thumbnail of what we think all ODR providers need to abide by. And we do have more specific criteria. Our goal at ICODR is essentially get to the point to be where we can credential ODR providers. A lot of the ethical standards that we have in the dispute resolution field are focused on individual neutrals. So we're talking about arbitrators and mediators. You have to be impartial. You have to, essentially, there's lots of different practice requirements. The American Bar Association, the American Arbitration Association, and the Society of Professionals in Dispute Resolution have come up with ethical requirements for individual neutrals in dispute resolution processes. At ICODR, what we're focusing on is not only the individuals, but we're also focusing on the platform writers, because obviously, as we were just talking about earlier, a lot of these outcomes are going to be determined by policies. They're going to be determined by software. So we're also trying to look at the people who are writing those platforms and writing those rules and giving them ethical guidelines as well. So, you can take a look right on the ICODR website. There's a link for standards, and it'll tell you what the different standards are that we focus on. And I can bring that up. Yeah.
And for those of you tuning in, Kevin put the link to ICODR on the group chat, so you guys can look there for the link to the website. Okay, here's another topic, and this is actually the last question that was submitted. So after this, we can talk about whatever we want to. Fees. We've had a lot of conversations around fees. There's a lot of different proposals floating around, from percentage-based, based on the disputed amount, to flat fees, to, well, let the dispute vendors charge whatever they want, and it's a free market. People can pick. What are your thoughts about fees?
Well, I've done a lot of thinking about this. I think it has a lot to do with average dispute value, and it has a lot to do with dispute type. If it's a consumer type situation and it's a highly automated situation, I really think it should be free or near free, because consumers feel doubly, if I got a $50 dispute and then I have to pay $15 in order to get redress, that's not a delight experience. Even if I get a fast and fair resolution and I get all my money back, I'm still annoyed that I was out $15. So if we're talking about more consumer type issues, I think it's got to be free or near free, and we need to find another way to fund the process. And that's the way it worked at eBay and PayPal. The resolution center was provided for free, but what you don't realize is every time you do a transaction, a fraction of a penny is going into the fund. So essentially that's what we do, is we build up a fund over time, and that covers the cost for the dispute resolution process. In a more B2B type environment, I think it's appropriate to charge a filing fee. Whether or not it covers the full cost of the process, I think it helps parties feel like they kind of have stake and ownership of the process. I also think ideally in a B2B context, the two parties split it. The complainant pays and the respondent pays, because then they don't feel like, okay, well, that's what happened in ICANN, is all the cases are paid for by the complainant. And the accusation over time is that the process has shifted to benefit complainants because those are the ones who are funding the whole system. But there's also an argument as to why just having the complainant pay the fee and then the respondent doesn't pay, because sometimes the respondent won't pay just to block the resolution process because they've already got the money and they don't have a grievance that needs to be addressed. So I'm a fan of flat fees. I think obviously if you look at commercial arbitration, they take a portion, just like lawyers, they look at, okay, what's the total value of the case? And we're going to charge whatever, 0.5%. of the case value, because presumably the higher dollar value, the more complex the case is. If we get into really high dollar value cases, that may be a better way to do it. Personally, and in the types of disputes I've seen arise on the internet, price tag is not closely correlated to case complexity. You may have a $1,000 case that takes you 10 times as long as a $100,000 case. So, that's why I like flat fees. I think it makes it more predictable for the parties. So yeah, I think that's the key question.
Josh, you had another question.
Yes. Implicit versus explicit agreement into arbitration. What are your views? Have you seen issues arise by not having people explicitly agree, or is an implicit agreement enough?
Well, no, it's got to be explicit. I think the main question in arbitration is pre-dispute versus post-dispute arbitration. If you sign up for a credit card in the US, they have a clause in the credit card agreement that says, if we have any disputes, we're going to resolve it through arbitration. And consumer advocates say, well, that's abusive, because at the point when you sign up for the credit card, you're not thinking about the dispute. You presume, well, I'm not going to have a dispute, so I'm going to opt into this. And then later, when the dispute arises, you've already signed away your ability to get redress through other channels. So that's pre-dispute, and that is relatively controversial. Post-dispute is not that controversial at all, even in the consumer context, meaning once we have a dispute, both you and I can agree that we're going to resolve it through arbitration. And then we can say, okay, because we know we have an active issue, so we say, all right, let's go use this process. Now, I will say, based on everything that I know about what we're talking about here, I think we want to opt people in to the resolution process. But what we might do is say, look, it's not binding. Like, you can go through this resolution process. This is what we did on eBay. You're opted in when you sign the user agreement on eBay. You're going to use the resolution center, and that's how you're going to get redress. But you can still appeal it in a court if you want to. It's just that 99.999% of people don't. So it's not pre-dispute binding. It's pre-dispute. You're opting in to this resolution process, but you have appeal options at the end of it. So that's probably what I would suggest that we do for EOS. I think, because the system that we built, so long as it's fair and transparent, the vast majority of people are going to be satisfied with the redress we deliver. And if somebody wants to pursue it to a court, fine, they can do that. But it's going to be such a tiny edge case that we shouldn't worry about it.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we are almost 50 minutes in. I see no more questions. So I'm just going to count it down. Going once, going twice.
May I ask a follow-up question? No, too late. I keep grappling with this idea of binding versus non-binding, because can you explain? Can you just maybe offer some thoughts on the effectiveness of non-binding arbitration? Like, why do claimants to a dispute decide to do that, and what incentive does the person that lost have to follow through with non-binding arbitration? I don't understand the point.
So there is advisory, purely non-binding arbitration where, you and I, we have a dispute. We're thinking about going to court. We go get an arbitrator and we say, okay, listen to both of our sides and then tell us how you would decide this case. And this isn't going to be binding. We call that essentially evaluation, right? And then
you're benchmarking your likelihood for winning.
That's right. Okay. And then we listen to the arbitrator. We both make our cases. We listen to the arbitrator. And then at the end, we look at each other and say, well, I don't know. Do you want to go with that? And we say, yeah, okay, let's go with that. And then we accept the evaluation, or we say, look, I disagree with you. I think I'm going to do better in court. I'm going to pursue it. But that's not really appropriate. That's more appropriate in a legal context. I think what I'm saying is there are multiple types of binding. Okay. At eBay, when you went through our resolution process and we decided the buyer was entitled to a refund, we would enforce it with eBay's enforcement ability, right? We would take the money out of the PayPal account. We would put it into the buyer's account. We might limit your account. We might say, we might even throw you off. Look, you've screwed over too many people. We don't want you in the system anymore. You're out. So that's binding in a sense that we're using our power as a network administrator to incentivize the behaviors that we want. and enforce our outcomes, but it's not binding in the court sense, right? If I sign a credit card agreement with Citibank and it has a pre-dispute binding arbitration clause in it, I'm signing signing away my right to go to court. So that's binding in a different way. Like, but on eBay, it's not binding. Like, I will render a decision and decide an appropriate outcome for a buyer-seller dispute, and they do have the ability to go to court. So it's not considered legally binding.
So I guess, and I totally understand that, and I think that for our purposes, binding means ability to be enforced, because
right.
It's irrelevant. It's legal meaning, because you can go to a court and they can do whatever they want, and the blockchain is just not going to care. So
I think that's right.
But even so, the idea of non-binding arbitration, if one of the purposes of it is to benchmark your likelihood of winning and avoid, spending all these resources trying to get it done, you're like, okay, well, let's just go do it how they said. The whole reason that works is because looming over this discussion, this dispute resolution, is that ultimate authority of legal repercussions, and you are going to get hurt if you go there and you lose. But when we're talking about it on EOS, the ultimate authority who can enforce and put that pain on are the block producers, as they can, when they arrive at consensus, or 15 out of 21, do essentially anything.
Sure.
So that I'm trying to grapple with the differences here for what could work for EOS, but I'm not sure where to go.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, I did some dispute resolution consulting for Second Life. I don't know if you guys have ever used Second Life. It's like a virtual world, where people walk around with avatars and stuff. They have their own currency called Linden dollars, and they have a lot of disputes. I mean, they have zoning disputes. I mean, there's lots of ownership disputes, IP disputes. So the thing about Linden Labs is their relationship to Second Life is not that of a regulator to the citizens. Their relationship is, they are God. I mean, they run the entire thing. If you have $5 Linden dollars in your pocket, they can click a button and it will disappear from your pocket, and it will, it'll shift to the other side. I mean, they have absolute power. They completely control that environment. And the reason why people are so excited about what you guys are talking about, and smart contracts and blockchain and all of this, is because it completely removes the need for us to worry about the traditional legal process. You don't have to worry about jurisdiction. The code becomes the law. So I think what we're trying to do here is design a system. I don't think we need to worry about, is this enforceable under the New York Convention? Can people go to a court and get these outcomes enforced? Like, all of that's the meat world. We don't need to worry about that. We need to write the code in such a way that we have 100% enforcement, completely independent from jurisdictions. And it's not binding in the sense that you can enforce it in a court. And yeah, theoretically, somebody could go file a lawsuit, but I would guess that 99 out of 100 courts would say, look, you already went through the EOS resolution process and this was the outcome you got. We can't, we don't know anything better than that. It was a fair process. It was transparent. It was run by an independent dispute resolution organization that was credibly impartial. So the court's just going to go with that. So that was the way we did it at eBay. You're going to avoid a lot of controversy by saying, hey, we're going to resolve our own disputes, and we're going to enforce them privately through our own code. And we're not going to make them pre-dispute binding arbitration clauses, because we're not going to worry about legal enforceability in different courts, because that's just a separate issue. Let that issue play itself out. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question 100%, Kevin, but I think we need to design the code, and be that escrow or be that bonds or deposits or whatever we do, let's make it so that it resolves 100% of the cases. And if somebody wants to go appeal it in a court, that's fine. They got to go figure that out. But we know the system works for 100% of cases, and it's got the clarity, and it's got impartiality, and it's got credibility. That trust, I think, that's what's going to scale. So, that's my personal opinion. But
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Colin, for waking up early per usual. We are now 55 minutes in, so I think we're going to go ahead and conclude. This is being live streamed on YouTube, so I will go ahead and give everyone the link by Telegram. And thank you so much. We have another call on Friday. It's with Dr. Andy Lee. That one will be in Mandarin, and we could translate it into English if there are enough participants. I think we'll probably make a game day decision. All right, thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for your time.